Okay, welcome. I'd like to warmly welcome everybody to today's exciting and stimulating line of speakers. We're delighted to have such a gathering of esteemed historians and social scientists with us at Yale, and are grateful that they have made time out of their busy schedules to share with us some of their scholarship and insights into possible intersections between religion and conflict. The MacMillan Center Initiative on Religion, Politics, and Society is in its first year of operation. It's designed to be an interdisciplinary home for scholars and students from around the university in an examination of problems relating to religion and politics understood in its broadest sense. Through a range of forums, the initiative is seeking to promote an open-minded and fresh look at if, how, and why religion impacts politics and society. To this end, the initiative is organizing or co-sponsoring 2 subsequent conferences this semester. The first is on Islam and the politics of political reform, coming up on March 1st, followed by a 2-day extravaganza event organized in honor of the distinguished historian Charles Taylor on April 4th and 5th. I hope that many of you here today will be able to attend those events as well. It will come as no surprise to anyone that among the primary concerns of the Religion and Politics Initiative is the intersection of religion and conflict. Today's event is the first of several conferences that we will be organizing in order to examine questions relating to it. What we hope to achieve today is to begin a sustained conversation among social scientists and historians about whether there is such a thing as religious conflict that can be analytically distinguished from other forms of conflict. Alternatively, is religious conflict simply epiphenomenal, that is derivative of other, more deeper material forces? If there is indeed such a thing as religious conflict, then in what specific ways does it differ from other forms of conflict and violence? Are there specific and unique mechanisms that at work in religious conflict and violence that make its manifestations more intense and less tractable to instruments of conflict resolution? Are there recurring patterns? And if so, what explains variations in patterns of conflict, religious conflict across time and space? While I have no illusions that we will have resolved any of these questions by dinner time, I fully expect that today's event will launch us on a stimulating and fascinating day of discussion and reflection on this most important of topics. To launch us on that path, I'm honored and privileged to be able to introduce to you our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Robert I. Moore, whose work on this topic in the context of medieval Europe over several decades has been elegant and provocative. Professor Moore was a professor of medieval history at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne until his recent retirement. He previously taught at Sheffield University and was a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. His previous books include The Birth of Popular Heresy, The Origins of European Dissent, The Formation of a Persecuting Society, and The First European Revolution. He's also the general editor of the Blackwell History of the World series. Professor Moore will be delivering a talk entitled Religion, Violence, and the Historian. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Moore.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sharma, for those kind words, and even much more for inviting me here to this splendid occasion. Just before the 3rd year after the millennium, throughout the whole world, but most especially in Italy and Gaul, men began to reconstruct churches, although for the most part the existing ones were properly built and not in the least unworthy. But it seemed as though each Christian community was aiming to surpass all the others in the splendor of construction. It was as if the whole world was shaking itself free, shrugging off the past and cladding itself everywhere in a white mantle of churches. Those words of the chronicler Raoul Glaber, the Bald, writing around 1040, may be familiar to a good many of you. for they're regularly quoted in textbooks of medieval history as emblematic of a transformation of Europe's fortunes that began at the beginning of the second millennium CE. The past, which was shrugged off, according to the firmly established orthodoxy, was characterized above all by violence. Europe had been devastated by the invasions of Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens from without, and the ceaseless and bloody warring of its feudal aristocracy within. In the 11th and 12th centuries, Western Europe emerged from violence in many forms, especially barbarian invasion and private warfare or feudal anarchy, a form of lawlessness so called because it pursued the family interests of the protagonists rather than a perceived public interest, perceived, that is to say, by historians, such as state or nation building or the expansion of Europe, or more grandly, of civilization. That is, invading and conquering the barbarians instead of being invaded by them. As that last point reminds us, there's violence and violence. The 12th and 13th centuries are still regarded, and in my view rightly, as one of the great creative ages of order and advance in European history, when the national monarchies, which became the states of modern Europe, with the portentous exceptions of Germany and Italy, established their sway over their unruly subjects, promulgating law codes to proclaim it, and building institutions to realize it under a dynamic and innovative papacy. I'm sorry, I've lost my place there. In the promulgating law codes to proclaim it, and building institutions to realize it in the secular sphere, as the Church reorganized and reinvigorated under a dynamic and innovative papacy did in the spiritual. It was no coincidence that these developments took place simultaneously with one of the great cultural flowerings of European history. Raoul may have been a monk, but his vision of lavish patronage of the Church, and by extension the arts and learning, as the preeminent indicator of peace and order, was universal. Assessment of the level of violence is not a simple matter for any society at any period, and has recently been the subject of a good deal of controversy one way and another for this one. But it's not evident, at any rate not self-evident, that violence diminished in the 11th century or even in the 12th, if only because most of the achievements which have commanded the admiration of posterity depended on it. Those same textbooks that quote Raoul Glaber follow him up as likely as not, with Abbot Suger's equally famous portrait of the incessant expeditions, skirmishes and sieges by which King Louis VI of France reduced to submission the turbulent baronage of the Ile-de-France. Louis's contemporary Henry I, the English Lion of Justice, was famed and feared for the cruelty with which he punished his enemies. Henry's grandson, Henry II, the father of English common law, exercised his rulership through the agencies of vis et voluntas, ira et malevolentia, power and arbitrary will, anger and malice, ruthlessly deployed to keep his enemies in terror and his friends in perpetual uncertainty. If the 13th century was the great age of European law codes, it was also that of the classification and persecution of all manner of minorities, of the proliferation of cruel and unusual punishments, of the institutionalization of torture. It's unnecessary to labour further the point that chroniclers, and hence historians, were a lot more likely to approve of violence, though they didn't do so uncritically, when it was carried out by acknowledged office holders in the name of public objectives: the establishment of authority, the maintenance of order, the expansion of kingdoms, and so on. In this respect, the vocabulary and judgments of the great 19th century historians who established this standard account of the progress of European civilization reflected, avant la lettre, Weber's classic definition of the state as the monopoly of legitimate violence. The writers of the 12th century, naturally enough, preferred recourse to the sacred. The peace of all things, Augustine had said, lay in the tranquility of the divinely ordained order. It was their position within it which legitimated, and indeed required, the violence of legitimate authorities. They and their successors also greatly extended the circumstances in which the Church was prepared to give its blessing to violence, most obviously when it was directed against non-Christians. Those developments will not be pursued further here. My concern this morning is with violence carried on under the banner of religion within Latin or Catholic or Western society by Christians against other Christians. It may be roughly classified under four headings in descending order of formal public sanction as warlike, repressive, intercommunal, and insurrectionary. In the first category, the Albigensian crusade from 1208 to 1229 was one of the bitterest and most momentous wars in European history. It was not the first to have been justified by the heterodoxy of the victim. Religious difference, real or alleged, was not the only issue that fueled it, or even the most important. It is at least arguable that the redrawing of the emerging European nation-state system, which it precipitated, was of much more lasting significance than any religious outcome. But this was the first time that religion was invoked as justification for an attack by Catholic Christians on a Christian and avowedly Catholic principality. The spirit in which it was conducted, or at least that in which it was remembered, is famously epitomized in the legendary reply, legendary possibly in both senses, of the papal legate when he was asked after the fall of Béziers in 1209 how the victorious crusaders were to distinguish among the defeated citizenry between heretics and Catholics. Kill them all, the Lord will know his own. For contemporaries and in memory, this was a religious war like none before it, and very few after in European history. Perhaps the Hussite wars in the 15th century, the German peasants' wars and French wars of religion in the 16th, the 30 Years' War in the 17th. Religious rhetoric and mutual demonization polarized the protagonists, intensified the brutality of the conflict, and prolonged it by blocking possible resolutions. It also became self-fulfilling. The categories, on the one hand Catholic, on the other hand the many labels bestowed on various groups of dissenters, both real and imaginary, were hardened and entrenched conceptually and to an increasing extent in reality. It's easy with hindsight to note how the defense of the faith had over the centuries become increasingly permissive in respect of those against whom the use of violence might be condoned. Augustine, against his own earlier convictions and those of many of his Christian contemporaries, had devised a justification for the coercion of heretics, but the Church long remained firmly opposed to killing and to war, even against pagans. In the 12th century, the alleged propensity of Celtic Christianity to generate heresy had been called in aid of military and political expansion of a Catholic, though not necessarily obedient monarchy, into Wales and Ireland. Increasingly violent polemic against the Greeks, including the charge that they were heretics and fomenters of heresy, formed part of the background to the conquest and sack of Constantinople by the army of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Whether that atrocity was planned, and if so by whom, remains uncertain. But if there was a design, it was for greed, not religion, and was immediately denounced in the strongest terms by the same Pope Innocent III, who launched the Albigensian crusade 4 years later. Nobody tried then or later to justify or excuse it, and the common anxiety of the narrative sources is to minimize the roles of their heroes and patrons in the events that led up to it. The case of the Albigensian crusade, correctly so called because the Pope had, since 1204, been offering the spiritual incentives and immunities associated with war in the Holy Land to those who would take up arms against the Count of Toulouse, is very different. The contemporary narrative sources, with one exception, are coarsely and brutally celebratory, and their substance, and until quite recently their tone, has shaped the historiography ever since. The harmony of Catholic piety and French nationalism on that point, until very recently, is expressed in the title of a standard textbook, La Crusade contre les Albigeois et l'Union du Languedoc à la France, Paris 1942, and the date is not immaterial. Almost all modern narratives repeat the story that Catholicism was on the verge of extinction in the Languedoc, a land long riven by the Manichaean heresy of the Cathars, against which its nobles, led by its principal lord, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, declined to act, leaving the Pope with no choice but to do so, especially after the murder of his legate, who had excommunicated the Count by one of Raymond's officials in January 1208. Well, that's a very long way from the whole truth. What matters from our present point of view is that while the Albigensian Wars were undoubtedly religious by any possible test, their origins were not. They lay in long-standing and complicated competing political claims which were rooted in the last resort, not in the culture, but in the geography of the region. The Counts of Toulouse were historically among the most honoured vassals of the French crown, one of them a leader of the First Crusade. Their remoteness from the northern centres of royal power had given them an extra degree of independence and prestige. They were uniquely permitted, for example, not to attend the royal coronation or solemn courts, for others an indispensable test of loyalty. But they had also, since the middle of the 12th century, the geographical position had also, since the middle of the 12th century, exposed them increasingly to the ambitions of others, including the papacy itself, as well as the kings of Aragon and of England. It was the propaganda of the last that generated the image of heresy, spreading like a cancer from Toulouse through Gascony and neighbouring regions, which remorselessly repeated through the last decades of that century, provided the rationale for the assault that Innocent III released in 1208. The accusation was first promulgated by a council of the Church, which I've just quoted, in 1163, less remarkable for the fact that it was presided over by Pope Alexander III, at that moment heavily dependent on the support of Henry II, than that it was held in Henry's favourite city of Tours, and on his instructions packed by his bishops, 4 years after the greatest military expedition of his reign against Toulouse had been frustrated by the intervention of the French king Louis VII. Such an intervention could not be easily repeated if the Count of Toulouse were branded a protector of heresy. The courtiers of Henry II were probably not the first European statesmen to understand that if you repeat something often enough and loudly enough, people begin to think there must be something in it. But they exploited it with rare skill, and over the following decades, many with varying degrees of credulity and vested interest took up the message, as historians have done ever since. There was a sliver of truth to lend initial plausibility to this caricature of the religious temper of the Languedoc or Occitania. The ecclesiastical reform, which since the 1060s had been vigorously, though patchily, enforced in the more advanced parts of Europe, made little headway here. When Bernard of Clairvaux visited the region in 1145, he was scandalized by the absence of the key measures associated with this reform, including more centralized control over clerical preferment, more uniform practices in relation to baptism, penance and burial, and especially the payment of tithes. By that time, however, attempts to introduce them, which Bernard's efforts doubtless encouraged, were arousing local resentment and resistance, especially in the castellated villages of the countryside. Over the following decades, the resentment increased, and with it the influence of the local champions and spokesmen of the traditional ways of doing things, often referred to by a conventional courtesy as good men, bonhomme. Broadly the same forces, in varying contexts and combinations, were bringing about increasing social distance and deteriorating relations between the clergy, especially the higher clergy, and the laity in other parts of Europe. Disputes over the control of ecclesiastical appointments and resentment of growing financial demands generated increasingly acrimonious accusations of avarice and corruption on the one side and of heresy on the other, in Italy, Flanders, and the Rhineland in the 1150s, 60s, and 70s. When the leaders of the Church as a whole had the opportunity to compare notes at the Third Lateran Council of 1179, after almost 20 years of schism, they concluded that they were confronted everywhere by a body of heretics, and I quote, whom some call Cathari, some Patarini, and some Publicani, but which in Toulouse and its neighbourhood had assumed such proportions that they practiced their wickedness no longer in secret, but preached their error publicly. On that basis, another 20 years of strident publicity prepared the way for the Albigensian crusade and for the establishment and empowerment of the Papal Inquisition, most actively in the Languedoc, northern Italy, and the Rhineland. In invoking the violence associated with that institution, incidentally, we should bear in mind that it was in a sense reciprocal, though certainly not symmetrical. In choosing the stake, rather than the recantation which they were invariably and usually genuinely offered, the victims in effect accepted the inquisitor's understanding of the nature of the conflict in which they were joined. All asceticism, as Nietzsche remarked, and martyrdom especially, is a form of aggression. That, putting it briefly, is how those who attacked and eventually conquered and colonized the Languedoc became persuaded, or persuaded themselves, that they did so in defense of their Catholic faith. It's not how it appeared to their victims, to whom the aggressors were the French or the Crusaders from the beginning. Nor did the war have the effect, as of course the invaders hoped it would, of exacerbating the division between Catholics and heretics in the native population. On the contrary, statements to the effect that heretics could not be denounced or ostracized because they were friends and relations are quite common. In this respect, the account of the Languedoc, constructed by pre-Crusade propaganda, was true. Catholics and heretics lived side by side without obvious signs of animosity or mutual hostility. As late as the 1220s, in the memory of those questioned in the Great Inquisition of 1245 to 46, open debate between Catholics and heretics was quite normal in the villages of the Lauragais and seldom attended by violence or the threat of it. That's not to say that there were never any disagreements between them about other things, or that when there were, the religious difference may not have been cited as, or in fact have been, an element of it. But it wasn't a general or profound source of social division within Occitan society, either before or after the wars. The role of religion in the Albigensian crusade was to assure the attackers of the righteousness of their cause, and by dehumanizing their opponents, to dissolve whatever inhibitions might have restrained the ferocity of their conduct on the battlefield and towards the conquered and their lands. Though it should be added that the extent of such inhibitions was not great in any theatre of 13th century warfare. An obvious implication of these facts is that the division between Catholics and heretics did not correspond to any profound or general fissure in Occitan society. A point the more noteworthy because by all accepted accounts, the region was politically extremely fragmented and socially highly diverse. Experts on it, which I am not, offer differing accounts of the social basis of heresy, and in particular of the relationship between its currency in the villages, at the courts of the greatest of the nobles, and among the citizens of the largest towns. What's pretty obvious is that no simple class-based analysis is likely to be right, and that if heresy arrived in the Languedoc before or more than a few years before the Crusaders, a view which, as I've said, I don't share, it did not owe its success to its appeal to any single sector of the population. Well, if the conclusion that heresy per se was not socially divisive in the Languedoc seems at first surprising, it's in part because the category heresy is itself unhelpful. There's no necessary, or in my observation, simple correlation between the doctrines of religious groups and their social role and dynamics. We may clarify the issue by returning 200 years or so to the period at which popular religious movements appear as a major force in European social history. The classic case, and the best documented, is that of the Patarines, who from the 1050s until the 1070s kept the city of Milan in turmoil with their attacks, including physical attacks, on the archbishop and clergy of the city. The campaign was directed at the clergy who were married or who paid for their benefices. Because the elimination of simony and clerical marriage was at the heart of the program of the Gregorian reform which reshaped the church over the next 2 centuries, of which the Patarines provided an advance guard, they have never been classified as heretics, though it's at least probable that their leaders subscribed to the very serious Donatist heresy, the one that had caused Augustine to embrace coercion, that sacraments conferred by unworthy priests were invalid. Conversely, the practices that were attacked were neither new nor peculiar to Milan, although the Milanese clergy claimed that marriage was permitted to them by a special tradition sanctioned by their patron saint Ambrose, and traffic in preferments had been routinely organized since the archbishop distributed the lands of his diocese as fiefs among its leading families, known as the Capitanei, in 983, and had been particularly blatant as the rapid growth of a money economy made payment in cash increasingly common. But marriage, especially of the lower clergy, was general everywhere in Europe at this time, and clerical positions and the revenues they carried had been a major instrument of patronage and a lucrative ingredient of seigneurial estates, at least since the 9th century. This did not prevent the Patarines and their allies in Rome from characterizing them as respectively the Heresis Nicolaitana and the Heresis Simoniaca. The Patarine movement was both violent and socially divisive. If you had seen the city with its deserted palazzi and now fallen towers, one chronicler complained, you would have concluded that you were amidst the ruins of Babylon, not Milan, once the noble seat of the kingdom. The word Pataria, from which the movement takes its name, is thought to have referred to the rag pickers who were the lowliest casual workers of the cloth trade, but its leaders were from knightly families, and its patrons included merchants and bankers. Priests were attacked in their houses and forced to give up their wives. At least one church was seized and taken over by the rebels. On the other side, riots and popular protests against the clergy were brutally suppressed by the armed henchmen of the Capitanei families, who roamed the streets, butchering and torturing at will. The divisions created or reflected in those events, however, were not only of class. No doubt, and this is a point to which I'll return, at least partly because it was a religious movement, inspired by eloquent preaching and united by shared worship and common ritual practices, as well as by religious rhetoric, it also divided families. One household was entirely faithful, that is, for the chronicler, pro-Patarine, and the next entirely faithless. In a third, the mother believed with one son, while the father disbelieved with another son. In this, the Patarines were characteristic of the evangelical movement, which from the early 11th century gave rise to a large number of monastic foundations all over Europe, and which equated the adoption of the religious life with the disavowal of family ties and privileges. 100 years later, Bernard of Clairvaux, main spokesman and propagator of the Cistercian order, was still quite ruthless in his insistence that family ties between parents and children, between husband and wife, must always be sacrificed to the call of the religious life. The Patarines also foreshadowed not only the program of the Gregorian reform movement in the Church, as we've seen, but its tenor and temper. The Pope from whom that reform takes its name, Gregory VII, Pope from 1073 to 83, flooded Europe with letters that urged the faithful, and note the word, not only to boycott the services of married priests, but to withdraw their obedience from bishops who failed to obey his precepts or to carry out his programs. That was a direct incentive to rebellion and was frequently accepted as such. In Gregory's time, and for almost a century after it, the progress of reform in Europe was regularly accompanied by civil disobedience, boycotts, and riots, by the threat and the reality of violence. It must be very doubtful whether the reform could have prevailed, as eventually it did, without it. The reasons for the violence which accompanied both the monastic movement and the wider movement of ecclesiastical reform are not far to seek. Those who inspired and conducted it had been among the losers in a widespread and ruthless revision of family structures and succession customs to secure family patrimonies by restricting inheritance to a single son, usually the eldest. This meant excluding from their customary share and their livelihood not only daughters, but younger sons and sons of concubines, all of course categories that were in consequence greatly elevated in importance and in rigor of definition. The conflicts to which this process gave rise, from late in the 10th century, were often peculiarly savage. Stories abound of blindings, castrations, and other mutilations inflicted by blood relations, including brothers, on each other, and obviously designed to exclude the victims from succession. From the point of view of the family, entry to the religious life, either as a monk or as a secular clerk, was a form of castration, and by no means always voluntary. The anger directed back at the family, that of course is one reason why the insistence on the celibacy of the clergy became so important in the middle decades of the 11th century. The anger directed back at the family by the religious is well known in the creation of a religious culture founded on the contempt of the world and its impurities. But two other expressions of that anger shaped the future of Europe. First, an elegant resolution of the property question was worked out painfully and piecemeal through the 11th and 12th centuries. The elimination of clerical marriage and the traffic in clerical office amounted to removing the church and its property and prerogatives from family control. On the other hand, legitimation and consolidation of the dynastic principle required the cooperation of the church, that is, of the dispossessed, in defining and enforcing the new understandings of marriage and incest upon which the dynastic principle was founded. Accommodation was secured by dividing the land and its fruits into two categories, secular and ecclesiastical. Access to the one was controlled by blood and the sword, to the other by vows or ordination and by office, and qualification under either heading constituted a disqualification under the other. Secondly, and less overtly, the younger sons, with determination and sophistication increasing through the period, and a considerable measure of long-term success, were instrumental in subordinating the interests and power of the family to the institutions of church and monarchy, of which the new order of social castrati, clerks and knights, provided both the theoretical and the executive arms. All of this, which I've argued elsewhere, amounted to nothing less than a social revolution that formed European civilization with its distinguishing culture and institutions, required as its first condition the shattering of one structure of family and kinship among the warrior class and its replacement by another based on directly opposing principles, on monogamy in principle rather than polygyny in practice, on strictly defined hierarchy among siblings according to maternity, birth order, and gender, rather than general equality of opportunity and expectation within the kin group, and in consequence of that hierarchy, on the lifelong and usually involuntary commitment of individuals to specific roles and functions with their accompanying privileges and privations. This was achieved without the aid of any central authority capable of imposing it, either by deference or by coercion, and indeed without conscious design, against all traditional values and radically against the interests of arguably the most elementary source of power in this society, young men of fighting age. Two things made the achievement possible. One, as I've said, was extreme violence. The other was religion. In the conditions of the 11th century, perhaps in any conditions, such a transformation of values as I've just described could not be imposed except in particular local circumstances and in the very short term. It must be embraced, and it could be embraced only if accepted and internalized, and by the losers as well as by the winners. That is why it was not only expressed as, but needed, religious faith, with its power to override traditional family ties and obligations, and to unite its devotees indissolubly to one another and to their cause in the face of every threat and every temptation. In Weber's terms, to replace the community of blood by a community of faith. And it is the construction of that community of faith which provides the link between the two parts of my argument, for it was precisely in its name and by its most brilliant architects that the Albigensian crusade was conceived and carried out as a crucible and consummation of the two great constructs which proclaimed its triumph, the Church Universal and the European nation-state. So, I must offer you some kind of conclusion. We've seen in the 11th and 12th century northern Italy and northern France what we did not see in the 13th century Languedoc. Religion providing the driving force which shattered from within old solidarities and communities, and constituting new ones, as according to the social theorists it is supposed to do, processes accompanied by a great deal of violence at all levels. It ought to be noted that this was a far more universal process, manifested in far more various ways than I've indicated in this talk. The competitive construction and elaboration of sacred places as the loci of dynastic and of neighborhood communities was hailed by Raoul Glaber in the quotation with which I began. But I've said nothing of the multitude of ways in which people rallied around the bones of their saints or acclaimed the miracles of their prophets, to resist rapacious lords, to give identity to new settlements, to proclaim urban communes, all of which activities might easily be, and routinely were, accompanied by considerable violence. I've said nothing about the ways in which both Christians and Jews became more assertively conscious of their religious identities, and so on. It's not too much to say that the whole history of Europe in this period could be written in terms of the formation and reformation of communities and the religious expressions and manifestations of those processes. But then, of what region, at what period, could that not be said? The fundamental question we hope to begin exploring, the organisers of this conference have told us, and I know that my fellow speakers will join me in thanking them as warmly as I know how for asking the question and for the generosity and hospitality with which they've invited us to join them in pursuing it. The fundamental question we hope to begin exploring is if there is something unique or different about religion that leads to particular patterns of conflict across time and space. The formulation implies some kind of comparison between religion and other kinds of social or cultural phenomena, and therefore calls for a definition of religion itself, neither of which I propose to attempt. The best I think my material can offer, at least for the moment, as a possible partial response, is a suggestion as to why the violence associated with religion is often so extreme, and as to the circumstances in which the combination is likely to arise. I hasten to say, however, that my conclusions are so little original that they're readily accommodated within some of the most familiar generalities of social theory. Some of you, indeed, may think that I've said nothing that wasn't said, or at least implied, by Weber and by Durkheim, and I plead guilty to that. More directly, Max Gluckman's classic account of peace in the feud suggests that violence within communities is self-limiting because it reaches a point at which the overlapping, cross-cutting interests of the protagonists make it counterproductive. The currently prominent notion of multiple identities, as elaborated, for instance, by Sen, similarly points to the multiplicity of interests and identities possessed by every individual in varying combinations as the key source of tolerance and restraint. These are, in effect, different expressions of the same point. Multiple identities create cross-cutting ties, which, among other things, imply recognition of the humanity of opponents because they share some identities with oneself, and imply also a relation between conflict and context. Conversely, the cases I've discussed this morning suggest that a key characteristic of new religious movements, including in general new movements within established religions, and including here the movement to crusade and inquisition from the late 12th century, may be to eliminate cross-cutting ties by prioritizing a particular identity. In Sen's terminology, a fanatic might be defined as one who sees all conflicts and issues from the perspective of a single identity. Consequently, the language of religion may be deployed to repudiate such ties and so facilitate the violence that might otherwise be inhibited. That worked for the Albigensian Crusaders. But neither heresy nor crusade, nor indeed inquisition, a story that I haven't been able to examine here, had dissolved or overridden the traditional loyalties and solidarities of Occitan society. Among those solidarities were traditional religious ties, variously interpreted, but which were not perceived by Occitanians as overriding or exclusive of others like those of family and neighbourhood. This conclusion runs contrary to a common understanding of religion, and especially of religion violently expressed, as the embodiment of ancient and unchanging communities and communal loyalties. That indeed is how it generally represents itself, and is represented both by its spokespersons and by its adversaries. It was also the basis of the concept of civilizations, which in the 19th and 20th centuries constituted the building blocks of world history, and the master narratives of it that prevailed for most of that period. One of its byproducts, with particular implications for the ways in which we thought about the history of Europe and of the Neo-Europe's, for example, was the image of traditional non-European societies as stagnant and unchanging, set firm in the moulds fashioned by the prophets and scriptures of their dominant religions. It was an image as much Marx's as Weber's, and still widely taken for granted only a generation or so ago, though it's now unimaginably remote, except perhaps at certain rather rarefied levels of the stratosphere, where turbulence in the upper reaches of the Ivy League occasionally precipitates ideological overflow into think tanks and bureaucratic channels. In the European Middle Ages, to the contrary, religion and religious violence were expressive and indeed constitutive of new values and solidarities at all levels of society, of discarding the old and entrenching the new. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Moore. We're going to open it up for about 15 to 20 minutes of questions. If you have additional questions after that, we'll move it on to, we'll save those questions for after the morning panel, after the speakers have gone to the morning panel. Professor Gorski?
First, I just want to thank you for an incredibly stimulating talk. I think we all needed to really sort of get our minds going early in the morning. The question I'd like to ask, I guess, begins a bit with the conclusion of your talk, where you suggested that one of the things that creates a potentiality for religious violence is precisely the universal character of certain religious movements, or rather, the increased salience of that claim that a religious identity trumps other forms of identity that we find at a particular moment movement. Insofar as it potentially uses these cross-cutting ties that create the self-limiting character of violence within communities. But when put forward to say that this might be pushing precisely the opposite direction as well, that it's precisely that universalism that also creates the potential for sort of reconciliation, overcoming of other kinds of ties, other kinds of sort of clanic or dynastic violence, for example. And so I'm wondering if perhaps what might be sort of the key precipitant then, what yours is actually be found in your discussion earlier, the way in which the Gregorian reform movement perhaps set the stage. That is to say that it has perhaps more to do with sort of moments in which one finds an alignment between sort of dynastic and hierocratic interests, for example, in some kind of social pacification. More generally speaking, whether you think the place that we really need to be looking is sort of in the battles within the dynastic, or within the state, or amongst political elites and clerical elites, and the way in which those create under certain circumstances, potential for alliances, right, with violence, political violence between religious who are legitimated and secular.
I'm not sure whether I've caught it all or not, but let me respond and then you can tell me if I haven't. First of all, thank you very much for your initial point that the effect of dissolving cross-cutting ties and so on could be to produce peace. That certainly is true, and one can think of examples in all sorts of, both large and small, all sorts of communities, new communities, religious communities and so on, in which it was so. So clearly, an important question which I had not asked, and that was because I hadn't thought of it, so I'm very grateful, is why does it work in a given situation in one direction rather than the other? And it may be that if I've followed the second part of your question right, that the answer to it is something like this. What I'm suggesting is that what you had in place on the eve of the Gregorian reform in Western Europe and in this respect it seems to me you could replicate it very widely across traditional societies in other parts of the world, was nests of local communities which had got very neatly arranged structures for distributing resources and power and prestige within their particular local hegemonies. And the way that it worked is absolutely clearly shown in the Archdiocese of Milan, where after the arrangement of 983, the Archbishop enfeoffed the leading families of the Archdiocese with the lands of the Archbishopric. Those provided the revenues not only for the family but of course for the church. The positions in the church were given to the younger members of the families, and they also, the families also elected the Archbishop, effectively chose the Archbishop. So it was a sealed, closed, hermetic system. And as long as it worked like that, then, so far as we can see from outside, that was fine. What happened in Milan, what happened in lots of places in Western Europe in this period, is that it stopped working. And there are a number of reasons for that, not all of which I would believe myself capable of identifying, but certainly two, I think, are of great importance and are interacting. One is that the economy stopped being able to support the level of the level of consumption that the system required, because population was growing slowly, but it was growing, and the pressure on the economy was becoming too great. And the other was that it was getting harder for societies to remain, local societies to remain hermetically sealed. They did start to have were starting to have increasing impacts on one another. So what happens in this period is that system of social organization is breaking down, and it can't really easily be replaced gradually. If you want to replace a system of a sort of semi-pastoral, small-scale agriculture, and that's a pretty crude description, but by and large that's what's predominant in Western Europe up to around the 11th century, beginning of the 11th century. If you're going to replace that with large-scale cereal cultivation, that isn't something you can readily do in most conditions by half measures. You have to reorganize on a very large scale. And I would be repeating my book if I went on. But I think that that's one of the things which makes the violence inescapable, that, as it were, gradualism is not an option. I'm not sure how far that responds to what you asked.
Any other questions? I actually have a question. How was it, would you say, that the church managed to win over the nobility to this idea of regulation of their marriages? So you talked about the move to the patrimonial principle, but what about for many noble estates would simply die out because they would have no heirs, no sons. How did the church manage to convince, cajole, or pay off in some ways the nobility to move them in that direction, where they submitted to official strictures of monogamy and no allowance for divorce or post-king marriage?
Well, I think that's one of the that's one of the really big questions which we have still only got part of the way to answering. But if you read pretty well any account of European history from the late 11th and 12th century, what you will find is that it will give you a very, sometimes very eloquent account of the tremendous level of religious idealism which was achieved. And central to that is particularly the idea of virginity, and especially of female virginity in the 12th century. In the 11th century, especially the early 11th century, it's male virginity that gets the headlines. In the 12th century, it shifts. In other words, monogamy is being elevated. You're getting, you will read a great deal about the cult of chivalry. The cult of chivalry is a way of getting young men basically to go without until they're quite old men, in the great majority of cases, and to persuade themselves that it's a good thing to do. Similarly, of course, that's what monasticism is about. So I'm not wanting to sound cynical, but what I'm saying is that if you look at the religious movements, including in the broadest sense, including the cultural movements, including the cathedrals and all the rest of it, they are organized around these ideas. They're organized around the sanctification of a new kind of society, which is no longer a rough warrior band society in which the more sons a man has, by whatever, from whatever source, the more powerful he is going to be, in which he trades his daughters for alliances, and so on and so forth. So the general answer to your question is that it was done by producing what we call the 12th century Renaissance, and all of that. The particular answer, in my view, has yet to be produced, though we know bits of it, of course.
Just a question about, to what extent does violence that involves internal heretics differ from violence that would involve people from entirely different groups, religious groups, sort of like Muslims, or perhaps anti-Semitic violence? In other words, does the fact that these are internally Christian conflicts make a difference to the sorts of patterns that one finds?
In the violence itself?
In the violence itself. Is it worse? Is it
Well,
harder?
my guess would be that it's not. That once you have crossed a line in which you say these people are not of us, then you do what you do. But I do emphasize guess, because the problem, of course, is a problem of sources. They use a conventional language to describe what happens in certain contingencies and events. And to what extent any particular event, the burning at York, or the sack of Béziers, whatever, to what extent, as it were, the conventional rhetoric is describing what really happened is not an answerable question, I think.
But you would say that what's actually doing the work is that once otherness has been identified, then the sociological patterns are fairly constant or dependent on local conditions.
As far as I could see, yes, I would say that.
Additional questions? Well, I think we're going to break then for about 15 minutes for coffee, and we'll meet back here at 10:30 for the morning conference.